Good evening, and welcome to Artist Talk on Art on Monday, February 13th, 2023. I'm Doug Shear, ATOA President. Tonight, we feature a replay of a legacy recording from March 3rd, 1995, when author Geno Rodriguez, a former director of the Alternative Museum in SoHo, which ran from 1975 through 2000, was in dialogue with the late Hilton Kramer, then head art critic of the New York Times. This recording is part of the Artist Talk on Art archive that is found in the collection at Archives of American Art of the Smithsonian Institution. This replay has been permitted by Smithsonian. You may be interested in seeing other programs that from our recent past. You'll find quite a few, more than 100, on our YouTube channel. And in addition, you may want to visit the archive at Archives of American Art, the archive of ATOA. And if you do, if you go to our website at atoanyc.org and go to the About page, at the bottom of that page, you'll find a link that takes you directly to our section of Archives of American Art. I recommend it. Next week, Monday, February 20th, we're featuring an open screening where artists are invited to show their current work. Would you like to show? If you would, just contact us at info@atoanyc.org no later than this Saturday evening, the 18th. And now we'll begin the screening of the dialogue between Geno Rodriguez and Hilton Kramer. I hope you enjoy it as much as I know I will.
I should begin by saying that I've been writing about art for 42 years, which that is having published my first art criticism in 1953. In Partisan Review, and like most people who have had, at least most Americans who have had careers as art critics, it was not exactly what I started out to do in life. I don't think there are any, kids being wheeled around in strollers who dream of growing up to be an art critic. At least I hope not. But if you survive long enough in it, it's at least I found it to be a wonderful way to live, and particularly since I've lived through an extremely interesting period. I think artists and others who have arrived on the New York art scene in, well, let's say the last 30 years, since the eruption of pop art in the early 60s, can have no idea of, even though you may have read about it, how different the art scene in New York in the 1950s was, how much smaller it was, and in a way, even for outsiders, as I then was, how welcoming and intimate it was. There were very few galleries that showed what I suppose could then, in the 50s, still be called avant-garde art. Now everything's avant-garde. I mean, clothes, perfume, underwear. But then the notion of something being vanguard was still a viable concept. And there were very few galleries that showed it. They were mostly clustered around 57th Street and Madison Avenue. This is before 10th Street developed. I'm talking about the early 50s, when de Kooning and Klein were showing it at the Egan Gallery, when Motherwell and Gottlieb and Hans Hofmann were showing it at Coutts, and David Smith and Mark Tobey showed at Marion Willard, and Pollock and Rothko and Pousset Dart and Ad Reinhardt and a good many others were showing it at Betty Parsons. And before Sidney Janis showed any American avant-garde art at all, as the 50s developed, of course, everyone waited breathlessly to see which painters Sidney Janis would steal from Betty Parsons across the hall. But that didn't happen until the market for that art developed. If you went to an opening at any of those galleries in those days, and the openings are usually on Tuesday evenings, you saw pretty much the same 35 people. You may not have known everybody's name, but you certainly recognized everyone's face, because it was all very small. It was, almost like a club. And then, of course, there was the club, the Artists Club, which was itself not quite what the literature has since painted it to be. There were no, well, with very few exceptions, there were no, sort of formal debates or panels. There were sort of rambling, spirited, incoherent discussions. I was a late participant in the club, although I have a very vivid memory of participating in a panel in what would have been the fall of 1954. I had just gone to work for the Old Art Digest, and one day I received a call from Johnny Myers, who, as many of you know, ran the Tibor Denargi Gallery, and he said he was organizing a panel at the Artists Club on what was then being described as the new figurative painting. Of course, the new figurative painting meant artists in Johnny Myers' gallery, Larry Rivers, Grace Hardigan, and a few others. And the other participants in the panel were going to be Alfred Barr, Clement Greenberg, and Frank O'Hara. Well, I had met Clem, but I hadn't met Frank O'Hara or Alfred Barr at that time. I barely knew Johnny Myers, and I didn't really think I was an appropriate person to participate in this panel. And I said to him, well, I couldn't possibly participate because I wouldn't have time to prepare anything. I mean, it was going to take place in a couple of weeks. And Johnny Myers said, oh, you don't have to prepare anything but your ideas. Which was that was the kind of insouciant way I think things happened at the club. And it was a memorable evening because for people like myself, the biggest game in town, except for de Kooning, who was painting his women, the biggest game in town was still abstract painting. But the title, of course, of the panel was the new figurative painting, and Alfred Barr made an astonishing prediction that evening. Now, before describing what that prediction was, I should say that Alfred Barr is a figure whom I venerate and feel is one of the sainted figures of the history of modern art in America. But none of us is incapable of making mistakes, and Alfred certainly made his share, and one of them was made that evening. And I think largely on the basis of Larry Rivers' painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which I think Alfred didn't understand was a kind of camp version of the famous Lutzer painting in the Metropolitan Museum. Alfred predicted the impending end of abstract painting, and said that the next phase of American painting would be devoted to history painting. And this didn't go down awfully well at the club. But then figurative painting didn't go down awfully well either. I remember on one occasion, Nick Marsicano, whom some of you in this room will have known, telling me, now Nick painted figures, though he tried, in order not to offend his friend Philip Pavia, who ran the Artists Club, he tried to disguise the figures and make them look as abstract as possible so that Pavia would not be offended and would not bar Nick from attending the Artists Club sessions. And Nick actually told me on one occasion, Pavia tried to persuade him to hang a painting upside down so people wouldn't see that it was a figure. That was before Baselitz, of course. In any case, the art world of the 50s was a very small place. And it was a place where very few artists of the kind who were involved in the club, either running it or attending it, and involved in the galleries which showed New York school art. Very few made any money. Now, about 10 years ago at the New Criterion, we did a special issue on art in the 1980s, and one of the contributors to that issue was Larry Rivers, and Larry wrote a little memoir for that issue of the New Criterion, in which he recalled what he considered, and I think correctly, was the night the club was finished. And he said that, you know, the artists arrived that evening, and the word was suddenly passed that Jackson Pollock had sold a painting for $9,000. And it was like an electric shock to everybody. And that was the end of the club. That is, there was suddenly money had entered the scene. Being an artist, at least a New York school artist, was no longer to be a member of a neglected secret society, an underground world, isolated, perhaps mocked, despised, but certainly not financially rewarded. And suddenly, this whole new phenomenon loomed, called success, and it did change things. People's character is very rarely improved by money. It's very rarely improved by poverty either. But somehow people get used to, at least artists tend to get used to poverty in a way that many American artists, I mean, European artists seem to handle it better for reasons that are hard to explain, at least for me. But American artists have always found it very difficult to handle big financial rewards. Something bad seems to happen to them. Unlike poets, I mean, Wallace Stevens handled success beautifully because he had always been rich, being in the insurance business. But you don't find painters in the insurance business. Anyway, that's where I came in, and the art world I knew in the 50s and began writing about in the 50s, where there was a great deal of argument, tremendous amount of argument, but it wasn't then political argument. I mean, I began my career by attacking Harold Rosenberg because I thought his theory of action painting was absolute baloney, as I still do today. I mean, you know, in his famous essay on action painting, he said that what the New York School painters wanted, they did not want to produce works of art, they wanted to create events. And yet Harold, like everybody else who acquired de Kooning, hung it on the wall just as if it were a work of art instead of an event, and took out insurance on it just as if it were a work of art rather than an event. So, I mean, life contradicted his theory, but his theory made Harold a famous man, and whatever little modicum of success I enjoyed in the early 50s, I suppose was based on the fact that I was the only person to give Harold's first book a bad review. He stopped speaking to me because of that. And that was a great lesson to me, that a critic who was used to dishing it out felt that he could no longer speak to a critic who'd written a negative review of his book, I thought was very unbecoming in a critic. So I will set you all at ease by saying I've never stopped talking to anybody who's criticized me. And Geno?
Well, first I'd like to say thank you for coming. I would like to say I'm very flattered to have you all here, but I know you really came because of Hilton. But nevertheless, I'm sure some of that will rub off on me. Well, while Hilton was running around writing reviews in the 50s, I was still in high school. No, well, I was in high school. The way I came to this art world was a little different. That is to say, it was more or less by accident. I grew up in a very poor working class community. Actually, it's known as El Barrio, New York's first and primary Spanish-speaking community. My parents were laundry workers, and I didn't find out who Vincent van Gogh, as I was telling Hilton yesterday, was until I was about 22. By that time, I'd already been in the Navy, and I'd come out, and I liked to make pictures, but I didn't know about art. And at that time, I didn't care too much about art, other than I used to like wearing a beret and hanging around Greenwich Village. But I went away to London and Denmark, mostly London, in the pre-civil rights era, because in those days, people like myself were advised to become mechanics. And I thought, grease under my fingernails, it's just not for me. Work hard, it's not for me. So I went to England, and I was given a scholarship, more or less, and I studied, and I worked, and I painted, and I worked, and I studied, and I got thrown out of school a couple of times, and I got brought back to the school. And in 1966, I finished my formal studies, passed the Ministry of Education exams, and went to Denmark and started practicing a very old tradition of art for architecture. And survived on that for a little while, and then decided I was tired of being a foreigner and came back to this country. Much to my surprise, as I took my slides around, I was being told to take it to the such and such place, because that was a place that worked with Latino, in fact they didn't use that.
Artists, the same.
Well, it was extraordinary to read Roberta, you know, her report from Texas. Unfortunately, she neglected to mention that there was the BBC did a wonderful film about Donald Judd. They went down to Texas and they interviewed a lot of the people in that town. And it's both very amusing and very poignant, the whole response of the town to Judd's work and so on. Now, Judd is somebody my wife and I knew because he worked for me at Arts Magazine as a critic, His sister was my secretary. He seemed like a very, sort of proper, repressed Ivy League character when he worked for me. None of us expected him to turn into this, egomaniac monster, who afterwards, when Roberta Smith collected his writings in a volume many years ago, Judd wrote an introduction to his collected writings in which he said, it might be hard to believe today, but Hilton Kramer was actually very easy to work for. That, I think, was the only expression of gratitude I ever received from, that was the way he made a living, by the way, while he was struggling to be an artist.
I would say that when I said maybe the New York Times has to hire Hilton back, jokingly.
No,
but I still think
I'll tell you something about that, though.
But I think they should still have someone with an oppositional voice, so that we get two reviews, or we get some kind of a somewhat more interesting balance on the writing.
He's not. But Judd wasn't California.
Judd was from New York. But it doesn't matter. I mean, she liked the work and she wrote it up. And there are people, I'm sure, right in this audience who think Bruce Nauman is great. So I think there's room. That's fine. That's her opinion. We don't agree, but that's okay.
Well, the Times doesn't nowadays like negative opinions. They feel that negative opinions are too elitist. And I mean, I left the Times for reasons of my own. The Times was always wonderful to me, but I felt, after 17 years, even criminals get time off for good behavior. And there was something else I wanted to do with my life, but it turned out I left in the nick of time, because the Times is a very different paper than it used to be. They don't want real analysis. They don't want negative opinions. And they don't want, sort of highbrow criticism. The paper's being, dumbed down to a certain degree. And they want their art critics to make art to sound as exciting as rock music. And with Nauman, they've got a winner. Because, he makes you feel just as bad.
I have something for Hilton. Hilton, as an artist, I often wondered about negative reviews, as much as I enjoy some of the ones that you've put out. But it seems that there's so little space in publications for reviews that it seems almost pointless wasting time on negative reviews when we can be perhaps lauding the better artists.
Well, it's not actually a waste of time. I mean, the only rule I abide by is I never write unfavorable reviews by artists that people have never heard of. And when I was in charge of the New York Times coverage, the only rule I set down was that nobody, myself included, could publish a negative review of an artist having a first exhibition, because I thought it was unfair to the artist, and it wasn't much of a service to the reader to say, here's an artist you've never heard of, and he stinks. But as the art world has developed, what I will anger many people in this audience by describing as bad art has come to occupy a larger and larger place on the art scene. And as it occupies a larger and larger place, displacing the possibility of good, because just as, they say bad money drives out good money and bad art drives out good art. There's a great deal of bad art that requires a lot of attention if you're going to give your readers an account of what's really going on. After all, the amount of art that, even with the, stretching one's natural generosity, you could praise is relatively small on the...
Wow.
You want some water?
Yes, please.
I understand what Alan after I met her. She's great for me here.
We get to watch ourselves on television.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
that's
you
very
can almost
amusing.
see yourself on the monitor. There you go.
I was going to have music before we start. I forgot.
Wow, I love how society works. Did you hear it all get quiet? All of you. No one said get quiet, but suddenly everybody got quiet. Welcome to Artist Talk on Art. I'm Vernita Incognita now. And before I introduce our founding fathers of certain parts of the art world, I want to make a couple of announcements this evening. My first announcement has to do with a party that we're having to celebrate our 20th anniversary. So for those of you who think you've just started out being an artist, it's been 20 years, and they were wonderful. They went very quickly, but we're going to celebrate it on St. Patty's, March 17th. And we have invitations at the table in the back. Take a few, pass them out to your friends, because the more the merrier, and we're going to have it set up so there'll be plenty of room for everyone. No talking that night, just fun, and maybe, maybe talking, but a different kind. All right. Another announcement I want to make is about an exhibition that one of the people that's been involved on a number of occasions with us is having, called Art Amok, Robert Costa, a diabolical experiment in painting. And the reason I'm making this announcement is because this is a different sort of show. Comes out of paintings that each of these artists have considered to be their worst painting. And everyone is going to be invited who comes to participate in repainting it as a whole, and then it'll be sold by sections. So it's a diabolical experiment. You know, the art world is changing. We've got to move with it and maybe try new practices. I want to also acknowledge Fulcrum Gallery, who has donated Artist Talk on Art its space very, very generously, and thank them. Here they are right here, Valerie and Terry. And yeah, you didn't think I'd do that, did you? And I want to also announce, no, that's all right, that tomorrow they're having an opening and you're all invited. And I think the reason they wanted me to announce it is because it's got such a dirty little title. It's Rust, Dust, and Smut, Dirt and Soot, a group show of 19 artists, 10 of which are not women. So it's very politically incorrect. Which will be good for our guests this evening, one of whom is very politically correct and the other of whom is politically correct in a different way. And we'll let you figure that out tonight. Both of our guests are quite irascible. On the far left here, my far left, your far right, is Geno Rodriguez, the founder of the Alternative Museum. And he's been around a long time too, but he didn't always have red glasses. And he is a champion of your traditional sort of art. You know, don't get involved with politics when you go to his gallery, okay? And on his right my left is Hilton Kramer, the founder of New Criterion magazine, and he is a champion of the avant-garde and political art. I just want to give you just a little intro to tonight, okay? So you know what the ground rules are, all right? I don't think I need to say any more. If you want to know what's happening next week at Artist Talk, pick up a flyer, all right? Bathrooms over there, don't touch the art, all the usual stuff. And at the end, I'm sure they're going to allow questions, and I want everybody to talk into the mic because you are making art history tonight, all right? And if you want to be a part of it, get a good question, phrase, make notes, all of the above. All right, see you later.
As nearly as I understand, there isn't any fixed agenda tonight. And so I think Geno and I will just begin by saying something about ourselves. And then I'm sure we'll all find something to talk about. Maybe I should begin by saying that I've been writing about art for 42 years, which that is having published my first art criticism in 1953 in Partisan Review. And like most people who have had, at least most Americans who have had careers as art critics, it was not exactly what I started out to do in life. I don't think there are any, kids being wheeled around in strollers who dream of growing up to be an art critic. At least I hope not. But if you survive long enough in it, it's at least I found it to be a wonderful way to live, and particularly since I've lived through an extremely interesting period. I think artists and others who have arrived on the New York art scene in, well, let's say the last 30 years, since the eruption of pop art in the early 60s, can have no idea of, even though you may have read about it, how different the art scene in New York in the 1950s was, how much smaller it was. And in a way, even for outsiders, as I then was, how welcoming and intimate it was. There were very few galleries that showed what I suppose could then, in the 50s, still be called avant-garde art. Now everything's avant-garde. I mean, clothes, perfume, underwear. But then the notion of something being vanguard was still a viable concept. And there were very few galleries that showed it. They were mostly clustered around 57th Street and Madison Avenue. This is before 10th Street developed. I'm talking about the early 50s, when de Kooning and Klein were showing it at the Egan Gallery, when Motherwell and Gottlieb and Hans Hofmann were showing it at Coots, and David Smith and Mark Tobey showed at Marion Willard, and Pollock and Rothko and Pousset Dart and Ad Reinhardt and a good many others were showing it at Betty Parsons. And before Sidney Janis showed any American avant-garde art at all, as the 50s developed, of course, everyone waited breathlessly to see which painters Sidney Janis would steal from Betty Parsons across the hall. But that didn't happen until the market for that art developed. If you went to an opening at any of those galleries in those days, and the openings were usually on Tuesday evenings, you saw pretty much the same 35 people. You may not have known everybody's name, but you certainly recognized everyone's face, because it was all very small. It was, almost like a club. And then, of course, there was the club, the Artists Club, which was itself not quite what the literature has since painted it to be. There were no, well, with very few exceptions, there were no, sort of formal debates or panels. There were sort of rambling, spirited, incoherent discussions. I was a late participant in the club, although I have a very vivid memory of participating in a panel in what would have been the fall of 1954. I had just gone to work for the Old Art Digest, and one day I received a call from Johnny Myers, who, as many of you know, ran the Tibor Denargi Gallery, and he said he was organizing a panel at the Artists Club on what was then being described as the new figurative painting. Of course, the new figurative painting meant artists in Johnny Myers' gallery, Larry Rivers, Grace Hardigan, and a few others. And the other participants in the panel were going to be Alfred Barr, Clement Greenberg, and Frank O'Hara. Well, I had met Clem, but I hadn't met Frank O'Hara or Alfred Barr at that time. I barely knew Johnny Myers, and I didn't really think I was an appropriate person to participate in this panel. And I said to him, well, I couldn't possibly participate because I wouldn't have time to prepare anything. I mean, it was going to take place in a couple of weeks. And Johnny Myers said, oh, you don't have to prepare anything but your ideas. Which was a, that was the kind of insouciant way I think things happened at the club. And it was a memorable evening because for people like myself, the biggest game in town, except for de Kooning, who was painting his women, the biggest game in town was still abstract painting. But the title, of course, of the panel was the new figurative painting. And Alfred Barr made an astonishing prediction that evening. Now, before describing what that prediction was, I should say that Alfred Barr is a figure whom I venerate and feel is one of the sainted figures of the history of modern art in America. But none of us is incapable of making mistakes, and Alfred certainly made his share, and one of them was made that evening. And I think largely on the basis of Larry Rivers' painting of Washington crossing the Delaware, which I think Alfred didn't understand was a kind of camp version of the famous Lutzer painting in the Metropolitan Museum. Alfred predicted the impending end of abstract painting, and said that the next phase of American painting would be devoted to history painting. And this didn't go down awfully well at the club. But then figurative painting didn't go down awfully well either. I remember on one occasion, Nick Marsicano, whom some of you in this room will have known, telling me, now Nick painted figures, though he tried, in order not to offend his friend Philip Pavia, who ran the Artists Club, he tried to disguise the figures and make them look as abstract as possible so that Pavia would not be offended and would not bar Nick from attending the Artists Club sessions. And Nick actually told me on one occasion, Pavia tried to persuade him to hang a painting upside down so people wouldn't see that it was a figure. That was before Baselitz, of course. In any case, the art world of the 50s was a very small place. And it was a place where very few artists of the kind who were involved in the club, either running it or attending it, and involved in the galleries which showed New York school art. Very few made any money. Now, about 10 years ago at the New Criterion, we did a special issue on art in the 1980s, and one of the contributors to that issue was Larry Rivers, and Larry wrote a little memoir for that issue of the New Criterion, in which he recalled what he considered, and I think correctly, was the night the club was finished. And he said that, you know, the artists arrived that evening, and the word was suddenly passed that Jackson Pollock had sold a painting for $9,000. And it was like an electric shock to everybody. And that was the end of the club. That is, there was suddenly money had entered the scene. Being an artist, at least a New York school artist, was no longer to be a member of a neglect.
Conservative. Now, I'm not holding it against them because, in point of fact, I suppose if the other guys had the opportunity, they would do it too. But I think that that's a reality that we have to face. Artists are not perceived as contributing members of society.
Well, I don't think that problem began with Newt Gingrich, and it's not going to go away after Newt Gingrich has passed over the horizon. I don't think it's true that it's only in the last 5 years that American society has discovered the artist. American society is in a perpetual process of discovering and forgetting about its artists. I myself, I can remember when Look magazine did a big roundtable discussion, you know, with Alfred Barr and Clement Greenberg and lots of other people about modern art. I mean, Life magazine, which then had the biggest circulation of any picture magazine in the world, and I remember cutting out the full-page reproduction of Picasso's Girl Before the Mirror and pinning it on my wall when I was a student. And then they forgot about them. And while the same company, Time Incorporated, was publishing this very serious roundtable discussion, many color reproductions, pages and pages of pictures, while Life was doing that, the same company, Time Incorporated, and Time Magazine, was referring to Pollock as Jack the Dripper. American society has an age-old pattern of discovering and forgetting and rediscovering and forgetting and rediscovering its artists. And in my mind, it's very much a question of what's more beneficial for the artist, to be forgotten or to be discovered. Because if you're discovered, first of all, if you're discovered, your taxes go up. Your rent is increased. I mean, the worst thing that ever happened to the American artist was the suit they brought to make living in lofts legal. Because as soon as they want a legal right to live in the lofts that they already occupied, then the Wall Street people, the advertising executives, movie stars, rock singers, they all took over the lofts. Now you can't afford a loft in SoHo, right? So, I mean, artists are often their own worst enemies so far as their role in society is concerned. They want recognition, and they don't understand how destructive that recognition can be to their own values, their own way of life. Everything. Brock once said, and to me it's the truest dictum any artist has ever formulated. He said, in art, every acquisition involves an equivalent loss. And you have the government for a sugar daddy, you're answerable to the government. You invite a government agency into your studio, you're answerable to the government for what's in your studio. I mean, it's called accountability.
Do you believe that art, in fact, should be collected and sold by artists?
Sure.
In that case, it seems to me, I remember vaguely from when I was, silly enough to think that I was going to sell art, my art, that there was a degree of stroking that went on. And that if you offended certain people, others wouldn't buy your work. So you're always accountable to somebody, whether it's government
sure.
or whoever.
But what you're describing is life.
Okay.
You're describing what life is like. I mean, some people, are going to despise you. Some people are going to love you. Some people are going to respond to your worth, and other people are not. I mean, even people in your own family might not fully appreciate what you're doing. But you think the government's going to solve that problem? No. And the Museum of Modern Art isn't going to solve the problem either. Even the people who are exhibited in the Museum of Modern Art have problems too. But I think there's a larger issue here, and that is that I think many, if I may say so, younger artists in the last 10 years have come of age sort of believing or having been led to believe that somehow the government owes them a living, that society owes them a living, that once they declared themselves to be an artist, that they should somehow be provided for. And that's ridiculous. I mean, it was their decision to be an artist. It was my decision to be an art critic. And believe me, when I started writing art criticism, I was making much less money out of it than even artists who weren't selling their work.
I think that's still happening today.
I mean, you do the things with your life you want to do, and to think that the government somehow owes you, I mean, if you look abroad at those programs that exist abroad, I mean, in the Netherlands, for example, I mean, the Netherlands, anybody who declares himself to be an artist is on the dole. It's totally destroyed the life of art in Holland. I mean, the only real Dutch artists who exist anymore now are they had to expatriate themselves to find some breathing room. I mean, the Dutch have now run out of storage space for all the art the government has bought. I mean, it's a small country and it's very flat. There's no place to hide it. In Canada, they've done the same thing. There's something called the Canadian Art Bank. Even Canada, with its northern wastes, they haven't got room enough to store the junk. I mean, and when was the last time you were interested in a Canadian artist? I mean, I have a few that are interesting, but for that matter, the French government is said to buy 51% of all the works sold by contemporary French artists in Paris. And who was the last French artist you were interested in? It was probably Dubuffet or you know, maybe Balthus, if you consider him French rather than Polish. I mean,
I kind of agree with you. I think that too many of us have fallen into a welfare mentality, which is, again, part of that culture of victimization and blame, and expecting. I mean, I suppose if you end up paying $40,000 to go to art school, and then when you finish, all you can do is do sheetrocking or working in a restaurant, you kind of feel a little cheated, and therefore you want to be supported. I don't think that government should become the patron of the individual artists, as you so well expressed. I think that government can be involved in cultural efforts and efforts which elevate our culture as much as it does in other arenas. I could easily say, we should have absolutely no assistance for the indigent people of this country. Sink or swim. I mean, when was the last time you met a homeless person on welfare that was worth anything? I mean, we could look at it that way. But government does get involved, and I don't want to belabor this government thing, because I think we have other things that are going to be a little more fun. But I feel that to let government off the hook. I mean, no marching bands. Let's eliminate marching bands. Let's eliminate a whole host of things that government seems to find worthy of support. All I'm saying is if you're going to support things, maybe it could be a little bit more rounded out. I'm not saying that it should be support for artists directly, but I think that there can be support, national support, for people's culture. I think it's healthy, but I think, like welfare, we have to look at the methods that are out there, the methodology of distributing money, whatever that money may be, and maybe change it. I think that there's room for discussion on both sides as to how one can further culture and cultural endeavors without making artists dependent, as in welfare or in a drug abuse situation.
Well, one of the I agree, we should get off this subject, but I'll just add a footnote to it. One of the curious things about the life of art in this country today is that, say, compared to 40 years ago, there is vastly more money spent on buying contemporary art. There is vastly more money spent on institutions devoted to contemporary art, including galleries, museums, art centers, university facilities, and so on. Vastly more objects are sold, vastly more words are written about the art, and above all, there are vastly more artists. I mean, about 10 years ago, some statistician claimed that there were in the United States at that time, in 1985, more professional artists living at that moment in the United States than existed in Italy during the entire Renaissance.
I thought that was New York, actually.
Yeah, maybe it was New York. Well, are there artists outside New York? I don't think in our fondest dreams we believe that we've produced the number of masterpieces that the Renaissance produced.
This is the danger of democracy.
Yes. Well, it's maybe it's the danger of 20th century life. I don't know.
In the Renaissance, they had patrons.
Yes, and they had very few patrons and very few artists. They had great patrons, and they had great artists, and there were very few of both, compared to our numbers. And the artists had to undergo very long apprenticeships, which artists today prefer not to submit themselves to.
Hilton, let me ask you a question. We
Yeah.
both went to see the Black Male Image and Contemporary Art show, I think 3 times each now.
Yeah.
As you know, I have very strong feelings about that show, as strong as I have for different reasons, for the Bruce Nauman show and the other 2. You said to me, and if I'm wrong, correct me, something like, well, I asked you, why do you think the Whitney Museum... First of all, anybody here see that exhibition? Because if not, there's no point in discussing it.
Yeah, I think most people have seen it.
Okay. I asked Hilton, why do you think the Whitney Museum would present an exhibition like this? And I think you said something like, because they wanted to create more liberal victimization?
No, I
Is that
said that to me, it was an expression of white liberal guilt.
Yes.
I mean, the Black Male exhibition had either no relation to art or only a very peripheral relation to it. I mean, the only talent in the show that I consider a real artist is Barclay Hendricks, and I wrote about him a number of times in the past, years ago, before Whitney had ever heard of David Ross or Thelma Golden. He showed at the ACA Gallery, he showed at the Studio Museum in Harlem, various other places, and he's a real artist, which most of the people in the Black Male show were not. I mean, they were either journalists or publicists or had a racket of one kind or another. Who? Well, Golub, yeah, he's a real artist. He's a bad artist, but he's a real artist. Yeah. He's a lousy painter, but I suppose he's a real artist. But he was also in there, to exploit white liberal guilt. And that's the kind of exhibition which we now call politically correct. It's supposed to, create sympathy for the victims of society. Instead, to me, it creates sympathy for what has happened to art. That is, art is out the window, and social ideology has supplanted it. With something like the Nauman show, the Nauman show has one thing in common with the Black Male show, and only one thing. It's designed to make you feel bad. And it succeeds, it's brilliantly successful in that respect. I mean, you feel absolutely wretched when you're in the Nauman show and your ears are ringing, for some time after you've left it. Your mind is filled with disgusting images, women kicking men in the groin and men kicking women in the groin and so on. I mean, real fun. I'm not going to.
Why don't we wait?
I'm not going to define what a real artist is because.
You'll get your chance later, okay? Let him continue a little bit.
Let us try to get a few things on the table, and then I promise you we'll give you as much time as Vernita will allow to ask all these questions, which I think are very valid questions. Hilton, what I was going to say was that my interpretation was, I didn't like the show either. I didn't like it because I said to myself, if I were a black man, I wouldn't want to bring my child in here. I thought that there was absolutely no saving grace in terms of the exhibition. Understand that I'm not interested in reading the rationale for doing an exhibition. I don't want the excuses for doing an exhibition in a catalog. And I don't want the curator telling me. I want to go and see the show and look at it and respond to it as visual art. But my interpretation was more that Thelma Golden was a victim of a hideous crime, in the sense that had that been a 27-year-old Jewish girl who who said to David Ross, I want to do an exhibition about the Jewish male in contemporary art, and I want to show images of Shylock, and I want to show images of landlords and this and that, and all the stereotypes, so that, as the Whitney says, and the funders, at least it creates discussion. I'm certain that the Board of Trustees would have said, what are you, a sugar? Are you crazy? Are you insane? That's our funding base. Are you crazy? They would have also said, you know, look, they got critics at the New York Times that are Jewish. Are you crazy? But you see, there are no black critics. There are no black patrons. And what is in it for the Whitney Museum? Possibly a lot of publicity. Because in America, if you can't be famous because you're a good artist, then you can be infamous. And you make money. You go to the bank and everybody says, oh, there goes so-and-so. Whoop, whoop.
There's also a loss of funding in it, too.
So the same thing applies to institutions which are kind of like corporate entities. So if you're not going to get good reviews for the shows you do, you might do the kind of shows that will keep you in the press anyway. Anyway, this is a strange little hypothesis. I'm always going into these weird kind of things, scenarios. But I think it was an awful show, and I'm absolutely amazed that unlike the B'nai B'rith, there's been no demonstration or outspeak about this exhibition publicly or anywhere. Now maybe it's that liberal guilt you're talking about. Maybe I feel worse for the people represented in the show than the people in the show. Or maybe it's more important for them to have a show. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think it is an appalling experience. It must be an appalling experience for certain blacks to walk through that exhibition in which you see over and over again degraded, exploited images of black men, either sexually exploited, socially exploited, or otherwise. But I'd like to shift the discussion a little bit and come at it another way, and that is that I think that one of the peculiar characteristics and problems of the present situation in art is that for the first time in my lifetime, it's an art scene without masters. That is, it's an art scene without great commanding artistic talents who set the pace, who set the standards, who provide aesthetic leadership for their contemporaries. Either contemporaries who want to emulate them, who want to rebel against them, however. I mean, there's no Picasso, there's no Matisse, there's no de Kooning.
Yeah, but you got Ross Bleckner, and you have
yes, but that's the problem.
Alfredo Jarge. You got all these people, young people emulate.
And so at the press conference that the curators at the Museum of Modern Art held on Wednesday, they very proudly pointed out that the Bruce Nauman show, in terms of the space it occupies at MoMA, is, after the 1980 Picasso retrospective and after the Matisse retrospective a couple of years ago, the Nauman exhibition is the third largest exhibition MoMA's ever done in its history, even bigger than Warhol. Now, if anything could better demonstrate the lack of living masters, I mean, what could demonstrate it more than that? I mean, instead of masters, you have, you know, people give you a headache.
Maybe we need to
I mean, I really do think that that is a disabling.
I think she wants to give me a little note.
No, I just wanted to ask a question that maybe would. Who's in control of the art world?
Nobody.
I mean, like, how did it become this?
Well, you see,
I thought you guys were in control. I thought the critics were in control at one point.
One thing I want to make very clear.
Critics don't have anything to say about anything. You see, that's why I can say anything with impunity, because it doesn't, I mean, it's not going to change anything that happens at the Whitney or the New York Times. It didn't even change things at the times when I was there. Or the Modern.
But you guys are the ones who make or break artists.
No, well, that's not true.
Well,
That's not true. Charles Saatchi can make or break an artist, but not me.
You know, one thing that I did want to make
this is the
clear.
era of the collectors, This is the era of the collectors and the dealers.
And they're all buying ugly art?
Mostly ugly art. They buy beautiful art that's old, but if it's new, it has to be ugly.
One thing that I want to make clear, from the offset is that when we talk about good art or good artists, I'm only speaking about my personal preferences. I think that I would never want to see anybody. I would not want to create a situation or believe that I was responsible for a situation where there was censorship of a certain type of art making. As far as I'm concerned, if there's any one person that is thrilled by, in this case, annulment, I think that's a reason for the annulment work to exist. But I speak from my own personal...
But look, none of us are in the censorship business. Who can censor anything anyway?
Well, there's a misconception that...
There isn't any censorship.
No, but there is a misconception...
We might even be better off if there were a little censorship. But there isn't any.
But there is a misconception, I know because I get asked all the time, I don't know why, about this inordinate power that critics have. And to quote Donald Cuspit, the only power critics have is the power that people imbue them with. But in reality, they don't have power. But there is a perception out there that there are power brokers, whether it's critics or directors of institutions or whatever. And I don't certainly think that I have any power. I don't think that I have made anything happen. I think that the artists that I've shown have made themselves happen. I've just provided them with the space. Now, if you want to say, yes, but why did you choose those particular ones? Then I would say it's because I'm a human being and I happen to like that work, or I happen to like that, believe in that person, and it's very personal. But, I don't, the old scenario, another one of my old scenarios was that back in the 50s, a critic, a collector, and a dealer got together and said, let's get some of these guys, we'll give them a show, you write about it, we'll all buy the work while it's cheap, then we'll sell it, we'll make some money, and we'll make some names. Now, I don't know that that could ever happen. I used to wonder about it.
No, the only real power in the art world today is the power of writing checks. No, I mean that seriously, whether it's buying the art or providing funds for putting on exhibitions, subsidizing books about artists, financing traveling exhibitions, other forms of publicity and purchase and exposure. That's where the power is. The power is in writing checks. It was different in an earlier period. It's not that money didn't count, but the sums were so much smaller, and the 50s was a period when an artist's reputation was mainly made by word of mouth, not by writing checks. And it was mostly other artists who made artists' reputation. I mean, de Kooning was as highly regarded as he was in the late 40s and early 50s, when he hardly sold anything because of what other artists thought about him and what other artists said. Even Clem Greenberg, when he was writing his weekly column in The Nation, and often the only person to praise de Kooning or Pollock or David Smith, nobody bought pictures on the basis of those columns in The Nation. I mean, Clem became a, quote, influential critic, unquote, 10 years later in the late 50s, when people began buying Pollock and then began saying to Clem, who's today's Pollock? But they weren't buying Pollock in 1948 when he was praising him. And when Betty Parsons was showing him, I mean, Betty Parsons could hardly, she couldn't give those paintings away, even though Clem was saying he was the greatest painter in America. But today it's really the writing of big checks that really shapes the art world. I mean, try to think of how much it costs to install the Bruce Nauman exhibition. I mean, it's almost, I'm not good at mathematics, it's beyond my power of calculation. But just the electric bill, would be a very cushy sum of money to live on.
I think that listening to what you're saying, I'm looking at the audience, and I see, not to make anybody feel bad, but I see a lot of people that are in my generation and older. And I remember when I first met Vernita about more than 20 years ago, how people used to, how people used to sit and talk about art, which was the leftovers of the 50s and 60s. And today, I'm looking and I'm wondering where all the hot young people are, because they don't seem to be interested in this sort of thing. I stopped teaching the year that, every year when students came into my class, I would pretend to be a student and sit in the back, and then I would clap and say, roll call, introduce yourself and why you're here. And I would say that up until about 1977, they would say things like, well, you know, I believe in, it's almost like it was a spiritual thing. They were almost like running for the priesthood or something. After that, they started coming in saying things like, well, I want to be famous. I want to be rich. I want power. And I think that that's where the art world is today. And I think what we saw in the 80s is a result of that. And I think that there is a desperate effort by the business of the art world to go back to that. I mean, I've always had trouble selling my work, even when somebody said, gee, would you sell that to me? Simply because I felt I was selling some kind of religious indulgences or forgiveness or something. You know, it just didn't feel right. Of course, my wife didn't think that was too bright, but the bottom line is that the attitude about being an artist and about creating work and what a work of art signified in my generation, I'm 54 years old, has changed enormously from when I was in school, art school in the 60s, where I quite honestly, for 4 years, didn't think even about having shows or about selling work. You know, I mean, it was not the issue. The issue was you worked and you painted and you worked and you painted, and Saturdays you went to galleries, and you know, that was it.
Well, the 80s was, in my experience, the first decade in which you had, you know, museum retrospectives of 28-year-old artists, you know, it's an oxymoron. I mean, you know, it's a ridiculous situation for, you know, to put on an exhibition by a 28-year-old artist and call it a retrospective. You know, it's a prelude to a prologue, you know, to an introduction to a preface. And of course, one of the real misfortunes that befell the New York art scene is that a lot of European curators, particularly in Germany and Holland and London, began competing with each other to be the first to discover American geniuses. I mean, that's why Naumann is looked upon in Germany and in Holland today, you know, as, you know, sort of a combination of, you know, Leonardo, Cézanne, Duchamp, you know, and maybe Wittgenstein into the bargain. You know, a guy like Rudy Blesch, who's now the director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. I mean, his whole career was based on, you know, doing the American retrospective first, even if he had to get them out of the cradle. And then, you know, MoMA and the Whitney and the Guggenheim, they all fell in line because after all, I mean, how can we let these Europeans get ahead of us in discovering our geniuses? So we owe to Europe, you know, the Ryman retrospective at MoMA, the Cy Twombly retrospective. I mean, the European curators made these American curators feel guilty that they weren't according recognition to the greatest living American masters.
Well, what about Cindy Sherman's of the world?
Yes, well, Cindy Sherman. Yes.
Well, maybe we should, is it okay if we open it up?
Yeah,
sure. Okay, now let's just start with the public.
Okay, the ground rules are you have to talk into the microphone, and I have to have a path here by the wall, so could you guys get real friendly with each other, please? And I'm going to have the first question, this woman in the black hat.
Hey, Doug.
Face the camera. You don't have to come out here. It's all right. Just...
All right. Hi, my question and statement is to both of you. What I was really not understanding, and it was really shock to me to hear when you were speaking about the government role in arts. I'm from Hungary, just to, that for you know where I'm coming from, socialist country, used to be socialist country. I mean, a government role, if you are looking at the history, I'm talking about only history of Europe, because that's what I know most, okay? History in Europe, going back to centuries, last 1,000 years, the government always had a very big role in the art, and even, not even Europe, in Africa and many other countries, you go back to the pharaohs, the church, the government, the kings, the pharaohs, they were always the supporters to art.
How would you like to have lived under the pharaohs?
That's why I don't understand. How can you say that there is no role?
How would you like to have lived
There
under
is
the
no
pharaohs? You're not answering the question. How would you like to have lived under the pharaohs?
This is not...
You'd be a slave.
We were talking about the
Yes,
role
we are.
of
We're
art.
talking about societies in which governments do some things for people and they do other things to people. And you cannot talk about the pyramids without talking about the slaves who built them.
That's true, but right now I was talking about the
Now we
government
have
role.
the pyramids and we
That's
think
true.
they're wonderful because we don't have to sweat over them.
Okay, what about during the Gothics, during the Baroque, during the Renaissance, all centuries when in Europe the government was supporting art? Just let me speak one more second.
Yes,
I'm
go
very
ahead.
short before finish. And when government gives money to art, we artists, we don't want the money for nothing. We want money for work. If I'm a sculptor, if I cannot do my work, what do? Do I go to be a waitress? I'm going to do some bullshit, excuse me, job, but I don't really know about nothing. After 8-hour work, you cannot do an artwork. You cannot be an artist. To do art Saturday, Sunday, it's impossible.
Well,
Let me tell
I
you,
disagree with you.
To be a good artist, you have to practice your art every day, and you should receive payment for that. As any other person, if you are a carpenter, you receive money for your carpentry. My skill is a
Not
sculptor.
from the government, however. Now, I think that what you're saying is, of course, a very familiar line. It shows the kind of damage that socialist ideology instills in the people whose lives are shaped by it. The idea that you can look back on the Egypt of the pharaohs or the autocracies of Baroque Europe as an ideal societies when they only benefited this tiny little elite at the top who worked as servants for either monarchs, ecclesiastical authorities, or the landed aristocracy. I don't want to live in that kind of society. Maybe you do. I know in that kind of society, from the social class that my parents came from, I would be condemned to penury and a lack of education, a lack of opportunity my entire life.
In another year, that's what we have.
That's not true.
That's exactly what's coming.
No, if you think that the government owes you a living, that,
Before we get into the complexities of
well, I
government,
haven't come here to discuss daycare.
I would just say that
In my family, my mother was the daycare.
I would say that the issue here is that this country is a country based on supply and demand. The problem for most of us artists is, as I said before, that we don't exist, and therefore there's no one to demand from. And therefore, if the public, and I'm not talking about the art community, if the public, the people wanted art in the plazas, the malls, everywhere, then it's their responsibility to pay for what they want. They demand it, you produce it, they pay for it. Unfortunately, the average American, it seems to me, does not have the kind of interest that means that there would be a high demand for art. And what we have is far more supply in terms of artists and their production than demand or want. So when we as artists go and decide to become artists, I'm telling you, I made the same mistake, if you want to use that term. Nobody told us to become artists. We just did it. And then we found out there was nobody out there that was crazy about us, that wanted us. So it's a terrible, terrible life. I don't think it's the responsibility that for government to support us, but I think it's a responsibility of government to encourage culture in such a way that the demand for the services of artists will grow.
We have another question over here.
Yeah, I was wondering what your reaction was to this week in the Times. Both Roberta Smith had this fantastic article about Bruce Nauman and all, you know, that he, I mean, it was overwhelming praise. And also then in the same week, Donald Judd, an article on Donald Judd, Sunday. I mean, two California artists, you know, I mean, like deification.
Well, Donald Judd was not a California artist.
But I think the New York Times maybe should hire Hilton again.
Well, you know, I mean, I felt suffocated reading both of these. I mean, they're just so, as I say, it's like putting them on a throne. You know, both of these California.
So Geno is with us, which is kind of unique because normally when we play these legacy recordings, and this one was a great one, I think, despite the technical difficulties. We rarely have somebody who was there. I can tell you I was in the room, and you saw that Bernita was there. There were a number of people from that era that were there. To share with Geno, the other instance that I remember of Hilton was that we did a panel. It would have been a little bit earlier, but not much earlier, because I believe it was in video, but I don't know. It was Dory Ashton on the left and Hilton on the right, and it was an artist somewhat to the left, and we actually found an artist that would allow himself to be called on the right, and it was called "Do Artists Support the Political Left?" It was a fantastic debate. And so there were elements of this. I think it's interesting that you, in dialogue with Hilton, although you didn't present yourself that way per se, you were certainly to the left of Hilton, and yet you had many areas in which you were very comfortable with each other, and that's a fascinating aspect of that dialogue. Jump in anytime.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to do it. What is start the video? I don't know. Nope, there I'm gone again. Sorry.
Well, put that back up and just talk. We don't need to see you live necessarily. We can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, now I don't know how to put it back up. Anyway, the bottom line is, my only regret is I didn't give Hilton enough time to talk. It's my poor habit of talking too much, unfortunately. But I would have liked to have had more audience involvement. The times have changed so much that it's just not possible to keep up with it. I mean, it's just you know, the art world is all about business now, and I just don't know how to deal with it. I'm totally divorced from it myself. You know, I'm happy quietly painting in my studio, and that's it.
Right. Well, I think that in your mind, and I would hazard to say in your soul, whatever we think about that, you're very much the artist that you were. Different, you know, different daily concerns, but the sensibility is the same. I mean, this is my observation. Maybe you're a little less fiery than you were in those days, but not much.
Well, the thing is, Doug, you know, you have to say, who are you going to fight and why are you going to fight? I feel very much that I was a bit naive back then. I did what I believed in, but there was some naivety because 20 some odd years later, I'm looking at the art world and I see how today, if you want to get funding, if you want to have an exhibition, identity politics becomes paramount. And often it seems to me that what's more important is to be au courant in terms of, and I'm going to use this word loosely, wokeness. I mean, I think we've gone so far to, it's not even the left, it's just fashionable to, to be part of cancel culture, to be woke, to be so on, to, some of the work that I see exhibited is really, really very poor in visual arts. I hate the word quality, but quality. But if you fit a certain image of the politically correct political identity, it goes a long way. I mean, I'm amazed at the Ford Foundation and others providing, $50,000 grants to females of a specific ethnic group. That just, 1975, that just could not happen. And now it's like they're throwing money at you if you happen to be of a particular gender preference or racial group or and so on. And I don't understand the art world at all. I mean, I'm 82 years old and I've devoted my life, and I can say I don't understand anything at all about the art world today, except that I really don't want to be part of it.
Right. Well, I would say that, in my memory of the art world, which stretches back quite a way, my childhood was spent in the art world. I think the main thing that we're experiencing, all of us who are artists or engaged in the art world, is the massive size of the scene that I'm capable of remembering the 1940s and 50s, what it was like. My parents were artists, so going to openings with them, going to the Hoffman classes, and just a sense that there was it was a much more homogeneous atmosphere, and it was also a scale that, Ivan Karp, who we had on a couple of occasions, put it really beautifully. He said that if you went to an opening on 10th Street and they would have multiple openings on the same day on 10th Street, you would be with maybe 100, maybe 120 people, 130 people who would go from opening to opening, and they were all the artists plus all the critics, or the three critics or whatever it was, their significant others, their dogs, their cats, whatever, even some of their children. And sort of the scene was a very intimate, very small one. And that was New York City. And so, and of course, the two or three collectors that might have existed at that stage. And it's just been growing exponentially, reinforced by the art fairs and the massive number of galleries and the ever burgeoning number of museums, and overheated by the auction houses. But certainly all of those phenomenon that the last number I saw statistically was there's supposedly 1.4 million working artists in the world. And how they even arrive at that, I don't know, but it is just of a scale that is impossible to even fathom.
Well, Doug, can you hear me, Doug?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. One of the things that I picked up on that on the recorded video, I mentioned the word democracy, and I think part of the problem is that starting in the 70s and 80s, if mom and dad had enough money to pay for your education at School of Visual Arts or some other school, at the end of 4 years, you were an artist. And I think that in many ways, that was not a healthy situation, because it just means that so long as you have money, you can go to art school and you could be an artist. And I think art school was only the place where you were taught to think. You certainly weren't an artist in 4 years. And as Kramer pointed out, to have a retrospective at the age of 28, I mean, what are you going to show? The work from the last 10 years? So you were 10 years work, you were 18 years old.
Well, we already have the phenomenon of collectors attempting to buy work from students.
Absolutely, but
yeah,
but it's not necessarily that they're buying works. They're buying commodity, and they're buying commodity that they feel like any stock will have an increased value. By the way, is there any chance that we can get some of the people that are watching this to join us?
Right. So, is there anybody that's on the on with us tonight that would like to unmute themselves and ask Geno a question or make a comment? Okay. We have a bashful audience, I guess.
I would like to ask a question.
Okay.
So Geno, have you changed your opinion of any of the artists you were discussing with Hilton Kramer?
I'm sure I have. As you get older, you get more cynical, in my case anyway. And I think that a lot of the artists that I thought were sincerely involved and concerned with social, political issues really were equally concerned with economic issues. And a lot of them made a lot of money and got recognition on the backs of a lot of tragedies in the world. And I don't want to use any names, that's that's in the past. But it's very hard to find people making art that can combine the visual object and the content in such a way that makes sense. And if they do, they often are not walking their way to the bank every weekend to make deposits.
I have a question. Hi, and thank you so much for this wonderful panel. But I'm wondering why you chose to air Hilton Kramer at this particular moment.
Well, that decision was mine, or mine and my colleagues at ATOA. It just seemed to me that conversation between Geno and Hilton was a very compelling one, and we got the rights from Smithsonian to sort of reopen our agreement with them, so that we could take 25 audio-only recordings. We have yet to use any of those, and 25 videos. And so we went through that, and we went through our whole collection, which now numbers over 1,000 recordings, to try to pick out those that might be compelling for various reasons. As we did, re-showing the Christos on the eve of the gates opening, or any number of the other ones that we did, Americans in Paris, and so it's not a statement in favor or against Hilton Kramer. It's just an interesting conversation between two different points of view, I guess you would say.
So
I think interestingly, Hilton Kramer makes some very good points, which at that time, 20 years ago, we might not have agreed on those points with him. But looking back at it now, for example, I appreciate the fact that he said he would not review an emerging artist and give them a bad review. I thought that was fair, and I think it's fair that if there is or are some particular artists on a pedestal, and the art world sees them as their darlings, and then going to continue to promote them, then I think it's fair for anyone to respond to that if they disagree. I mean, I think art is a dialogue, and I think it's not just a dialogue between the artist and the critic. It's a dialogue between the artwork and the viewer. It's a dialogue between the markets. It's very complex, but I think that, yes, there is a place for some hard critique, and I think it's easy to critique your enemies, but very difficult to critique your friends or the artists that you like. So I'm sorry that he's gone. He's not with us anymore. I would have loved to have heard his voice today. But I think a lot of what's going on in the art world is the responsibility also of artists. It's not just the responsibility of the kingmakers, but I think it's also artists need to speak up and stand up for what they believe in, even if it's going to hurt them. Certainly, I know about cutting your nose off in spite of your face. I'm practically noseless, so to speak. And I think that I have no regrets for that. If I have any regrets, is that I talk too much. That's it. Other than that, you have to stand up for what you believe in without exceptions, even if it means having a hard time within your community, your society, or whatever, the art world that you live in and so on. But I don't know.
So I have a question, though, for you and for everybody else. Do you think it's true what Hilton Kramer said, that he had no influence on whether people bought art or whether people became famous?
I think he's, I think we give too much credit to critics. I think he's absolutely right. The money talks and the bullshit walks. I mean, the reality is, if Gagosian starts showing a young artist, they're immediately going to get press. There's immediately going to be a belief that this is a great artist, that there's money to be made with this artist. So I think that, it's all about who's buying and why they're buying and what they're doing with the work. Is it staying in the crate and going into a Swiss vault, or is it being shared with other people? But I think critics can hurt you, but they can only hurt you when people that are not thinkers read the article and say, oh yes, well, if so-and-so says it's good or bad, then it's good or bad. But this is a problem with a lot of critiques, whether it's movies, films, whatever, or critiques of other human beings. How often haven't we met someone who had been very badly criticized by their peers, and then you meet them and say, my God, this person's quite nice. They're not at all like that. Because you make up your own mind by visiting that personality or by visiting that work of art. You make your own mind up. You don't necessarily rely on other people to tell you who to marry or who to beat up on. Make up your own mind. Critics are interesting insofar as they can provide some insights, personal insights, that you can then think about and agree or disagree with and even challenge. I mean, I think that's our responsibility as creative people, is to challenge.
I'd like to take this moment, Greta, if you don't mind, to thank Geno and to thank Hilton in absentia, wherever Hilton is these days. And thank you all for joining us tonight, and hope you will join us on other Monday nights.
Thank you.
And thank you very much, Geno.
Thanks, Doug. Good doing this with you.
Thank you very much.
talk soon.
My pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.